In the last lecture, we saw that for most of 2 centuries, scholars have maintained that the Gospels contain stories about Jesus that are trying to convey truths about him, but that are not historically accurate. I should point out that just because this is the consensus among scholars doesn't make it true. The only way to be convinced is to look at the surviving evidence. And scholarly opinion, even highly informed scholarly opinion, is not evidence. In this case, the evidence comes from the Gospels themselves. As we'll see, there are compelling reasons for thinking that the Gospels contain stories that cannot be historically accurate, at least historically accurate as they're narrated. In this lecture, we'll look at some of this evidence. In short, it is of 2 kinds. First, some stories are told by more than one gospel, and often there are discrepancies between their accounts. These discrepancies must indicate that the stories came to be changed at some point, and that they cannot both be accurate. Second, some of the stories are completely implausible in light of what we already know about the ancient world. Here I'm not referring to miracles, which of course by their very nature are implausible, but which I'll not discuss until a later lecture. Here I'm referring to other events that are narrated but don't appear to be historically plausible, non-miraculous events. The only way to evaluate these kinds of evidence is to engage in a detailed analysis of specific accounts. In other words, it's not good enough simply to say the Gospels contradict themselves and they're implausible. You have to look at the evidence to see whether in fact those statements are true. What I'm going to do in this lecture is look at 2 examples drawn from the stories of Jesus' birth and his death in order to show how this kind of evidence works. These aren't the only examples I could have chosen. I could have chosen a wide range of things, but I thought it would make sense to deal with accounts of the beginning of Jesus, the end of Jesus' life. I should stress that I'm not disputing the basic accuracy of these stories in general. Jesus obviously was born, and he did die. But, as we'll see, the accounts of these historical events, as narrated in the Gospels, are plagued with historical problems. I'm going to begin with the accounts of Jesus' death, and I'm going to look at 2 of the Gospel accounts of the event. I'll be looking at the earliest account we have, that found in the Gospel of Mark, and then the latest we have among our canonical Gospels, the Gospel of John. And I'm going to show that, in fact, these 2 accounts are very difficult to reconcile with one another in some of their specifics. Before showing the differences between these accounts, I should point out that there are many similarities between them, as you can see for yourself simply by reading them and jotting down the things that happen. The accounts are found in Mark chapters 14 and 15, and John chapters 18 and 19. The basic storyline is the same in the 2 Gospels. Both have the same cast of characters. We have Jesus, the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, the criminal Barabbas, the antagonistic Jewish leaders, and the easily swayed Jewish crowds. All these characters appear in both stories and in pretty much the same relationship with one another. In both accounts, Jesus has a last meal with his disciples, after which he goes out to pray. He's then betrayed by one of the 12, Judas Iscariot, and is deserted by the other disciples. Jesus is arrested by Jewish authorities. He spends the night in prison and then appears before Pontius Pilate, who tries to release him in both accounts, but is persuaded by the crowds to release the criminal Barabbas instead. In both narratives, Jesus is then ordered by Pilate to be executed, and he's taken off and is crucified. So there are numerous similarities between the two accounts. I'd say in broad, general outline, the skeletons of the stories are very much the same. There are, however, striking differences as well. Some of these differences could probably be reconciled with one another if one worked hard enough at it. Let me point out some of the differences between the two accounts to show how, in fact, they could be reconciled even though they're different. In other words, to say that there's a difference isn't the same thing as to say that there's a discrepancy. And so first I'm going to look at some differences that are not necessarily discrepancies, and then look at one particular aspect of the stories that does appear to be a discrepancy. So some of the differences that are not discrepancies. Mark's account indicates that Jesus, Pilate, the Jewish leaders, and the crowds are all together in one place. There's a very short trial in which Jesus speaks only 2 words in Mark's account. The words, "you say so," in Greek, "su leges," "you say so." He says this when Pilate asks him if he's the king of the Jews. The account then works as follows. Mark chapter 15, it states that as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. These are the Jewish leaders. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Okay, we have an account where you have a very brief trial going on. The Jewish leaders, Pilate, Jesus, they're all in the same place. The leaders are accusing Jesus. Pilate is asking him questions, and Jesus simply says, "You say so," with no further defense. As it goes on, then Pilate tries to release Jesus, but the crowds insist on Barabbas, and Pilate, in verse 15, gives in to their wishes, and after having Jesus flogged, hands Jesus over to be crucified. A very brief trial in one place where Jesus says hardly anything. This stands in some contrast with the account of Jesus' trial found in John's Gospel. John's narrative does not indicate that it's a short trial that takes place all in one location. The account is found in beginning in John chapter 18, verse 28. The Jewish leaders have brought Jesus from Caiaphas, the high priest, to Pilate's headquarters. We're told that it was early in the morning. They themselves, according to John, the Jewish leaders themselves, did not enter Pilate's headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. The Jewish leaders refused to go into Pilate's place of residence, his headquarters, because they don't want to be defiled because they have to eat the Passover meal that evening. I'll explain the Passover meal later in this lecture. The point, though, is what this does to the trial narrative. The leaders don't go with Jesus into Pilate. They send Jesus in by himself. And from here on out, what happens in the trial is that Pilate goes back and forth between Jesus, the accused, and the Jewish leaders, the accusers. And so in verse 29, Pilate went out to the Jewish leaders and said what accusation to bring against him. He has a conversation then with the Jewish leaders. Verse 33, then Pilate entered into the headquarters and summons Jesus and talks with him, which goes on for 6 verses. Afterwards, verse 38, Pilate goes outside to the Jews to talk to Jesus' accusers. Then Pilate goes back in and brings Jesus out and flogs him. Then Pilate sends him back in, and he comes back out again himself. Verse 4, talks with the accusers. Then he goes back in. Verse 9 of chapter 19, enters the headquarters and talks to Jesus again. Afterward, verse 13, he comes back out again. Pilate goes back and forth between the accusers and the accused in conducting this trial. Moreover, in this account, rather than simply saying, "You say so," 2 words in Greek, Jesus gives 2 rather long speeches to his judge, to Pilate, on the inside, when the Jewish leaders are on the outside and don't hear these speeches. Now, my point at this stage is simply that these two narratives are fairly different in the way they've set up the trial. In one, they're all in one place, and the other, Pilate has to go back and forth inside and outside of his praetorium, his headquarters. In theory, one could argue that both accounts are accurate insofar as they go. In other words, that Mark simply didn't indicate that Jesus' judge and his accusers were in different locations, and Mark simply didn't indicate that Jesus, in fact, gave several longer replies to Pilate's question. Mark simply didn't mention these things that are found in John, and therefore you can reconcile these accounts. It's a common way to reconcile differences in the Gospels, simply to say that both Gospels are right insofar as they narrate what they do, or that if two Gospels narrate the same event but have differences, that the same event actually happened on different occasions. For example, immediately prior to this account, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is said to have gone into the temple and driven out the money changers and those selling animals, and to cause a bit of a ruckus in the temple. According to Mark, it was right before this trial. It's what leads to his arrest. According to John, Jesus cleansed the temple, but he did it not at the very last week of his life, but at the very beginning of his life. Well, how do you reconcile these two? Well, one way to do it is to say that Jesus cleansed the temple twice, once at the beginning of his ministry and once at the end. Or, in another account, we're told, in Mark's account, we're told that Jesus predicted that when he was arrested, that his apostle Peter would deny him 3 times before the cock crowed. In another account, Jesus is said to have told Peter that he'll deny him 3 times before the cock crows twice. Well, how do you reconcile the two? Well, one way to say is that Jesus told Peter that he'd deny him 6 times, 3 times before the cock crowed, and 3 times before it crowed twice. You can reconcile the account by saying that one or both of the Gospels didn't include all of the information. That's possibly what's going on here in the trial before Pilate. The problem is that there are other differences between Mark and John that are difficult to reconcile with one another, no matter how much one tries. In particular, there's a discrepancy over when this event takes place. Now, this might seem like a small detail, but one needs to think of historical evidence like evidence at an accident or a crime scene, where you're trying to figure out what really happened. Sometimes the tiniest shred of evidence, a fingerprint or a strand of hair, will unlock the most significant case. For example, a bank robbery or a murder or a presidential sex scandal. So too in historical research, sometimes the smallest clues can have huge consequences. In this instance, the clue has to do with a simple question: when did Jesus die? To answer the question, I need to provide some historical background information and then look carefully at each account. Both Mark and John indicate that Jesus died during the feast of the Passover, the annual festival celebrated by Jews in Jerusalem to commemorate the events of the Exodus. The festival had as its background the stories of God's deliverance of his people Israel from their slavery in Egypt through Moses, as recorded in the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible. In Jesus' day, the festival was a major event. Jews came from around the world to celebrate the feast in Jerusalem. They would arrive a week in advance to undergo a ritual of purification that would allow them to eat the meal. They needed to be ritually pure for a week, and so they'd come a week early. The afternoon before the Passover meal was eaten, Jews would bring a lamb, which was to be eaten as part of the celebration, to the temple, or else they would purchase a lamb there at the temple so that it could be sacrificed by the priests. The rest of the day was spent in preparing the meal for that evening. That day, when they're preparing the meal, therefore, was called the day of preparation for the Passover. Now, it's important for this illustration to remember that in Jewish reckoning, a new day begins not at midnight, as it does for us, but when it gets dark. Even today, Jewish Sabbath begins on Friday evening at dark and continues through Saturday until it gets dark again. So, during the festival, after the lambs were sacrificed, their blood drained, they were given back to the Jewish worshippers, who took them home to cook them for the meal, which was then eaten after it got dark, that is, on the day of Passover itself. The meal itself consisted of several symbolic foods to recall Israel's slavery in Egypt and their deliverance by God. Now we're ready to compare in detail the two accounts of Jesus' trial, his arrest and trial. The comparison is interesting because both Mark and John give us a precise description of when, in relationship to the Passover meal, Jesus was crucified. We can begin with the earlier account, the account of Mark. The day before his arrest in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' disciples ask him where they are to prepare for themselves and Jesus the Passover meal. Mark chapter 14, verse 12. Jesus gives them instructions. This then is taking place on the day of preparation for the Passover. They prepare the meal. That night, they have it. At the meal, Jesus takes the symbolic foods of the Passover and instills new significance in them. He takes the bread and says, "This is my body." He takes the cup of wine and says, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood." Afterwards, according to Mark, Jesus goes out to pray. He's betrayed by Judas Iscariot, handed over to the Jewish authorities for trial, and then he spends the night in jail. The next morning, that is, the morning of Passover, the day after the lambs were slain, the morning after the Passover meal had been eaten, Jesus appears before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, who finds him guilty of criminal charges and orders him executed. Jesus is immediately taken off and is crucified. According to Mark chapter 15, verse 25, it takes place at 9 o'clock in the morning. And so Jesus is executed 9 o'clock in the morning, the day of the Passover, the day after the lambs had been killed and eaten. This dating of the event in Mark stands in stark contrast with what we find in the Gospel of John. Here, too, Jesus has a last meal with his disciples. But in John, there's no word of it being a Passover meal. The disciples in this gospel never ask Jesus where they are to prepare the Passover for him, and Jesus does not speak about the symbolic foods in a new way at this meal. He has a last meal, but there's no word about it being a Passover meal. After the meal, again, he goes out to pray. He's betrayed by Judas. He's arrested. He spends the night in jail. And the next day, he appears before Pontius Pilate. But as we've seen, we're told that the Jewish leaders, who were his accusers, refused to enter Pilate's residence because they don't want to become ritually defiled and so prevented from eating the Passover meal that evening. Chapter 18, verse 28. Eat the Passover meal that evening. Hadn't they already eaten the meal the night before? The problem is clarified at the end of Jesus' trial when we're told exactly when he was condemned and led off to be executed. John chapter 19, verse 14. Pilate pronounces his condemnation of Jesus, and we're told, "Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon." The day of preparation for the Passover? How could it be the day of preparation? According to Mark's gospel, Jesus lived through that day, had the Passover meal with his disciples that evening, and was put on the cross the next morning on the day of Passover itself. In John's gospel, though, Jesus was executed before the meal even began. It's probably impossible to reconcile this discrepancy if you want to explain how both accounts can be historically accurate. Jesus is killed at a different time on a different day in John than in the Synoptics. But it is possible to explain why the discrepancy came about. The Gospel of John is the only gospel of the New Testament that explicitly identifies Jesus himself as, quote, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. These are the words of John the Baptist in John chapter 1, verse 29. He says the same thing 7 verses later. Behold, the Lamb of God. This is also the only gospel in which Jesus is said to die on the afternoon of the day before the Passover, precisely when the lambs were being slaughtered. In the judgment of most scholars, it appears that John has changed a historical datum in order to make a theological point. That is to say, that he's changed the day and the hour of Jesus' death precisely to show that Jesus really was the Lamb of God, who was slain on the same day and at the same hour and at the hands of the same people, the chief priests, who slew the Passover lambs. This is one kind of evidence to suggest that the Gospels contain some accounts that cannot be historically accurate, at least in all their details. See, because John and Mark can't be reconciled on these terms, even though you can explain why you have the discrepancy. Dozens of this kind of discrepancy could be discussed from the New Testament Gospels. Here, though, I'll just look at one other account, accounts of Jesus' birth. The stories of Jesus' birth are found in our two other Gospels, Matthew and Luke. These accounts also are historically problematic. Again, in the accounts of Jesus' birth, there are some basic similarities. In both Matthew and Luke, Jesus is born to the Virgin Mary in Bethlehem. But again, there are also numerous differences between the accounts. In this case, there are probably more differences than similarities, although again, a number of the differences are not actually discrepancies. Sometimes as an exercise for my students in my undergraduate classes, I have them compare these two accounts. I have them read the Gospel of Matthew, list everything that happens in Matthew, and then read the account in Luke and list everything that happens in Luke. What is remarkable is that the lists are almost completely different from one another, so that the Christmas story that we hear every December, in fact, is a conflation of the two accounts, so that the stories of one and the stories of the other are put together so that we have one big account, whereas the Gospels themselves provide two different sets of stories. As examples of some differences that you might be able to reconcile some of these. Luke alone indicates that Joseph and Mary had come to Bethlehem in order to register for a census, because during the days of the Syrian governor Quirinius, says Luke, Caesar Augustus had decreed that the whole world, which presumably means the whole Roman Empire, should be taxed. Everyone, therefore, needed to register at their ancestral home, and since Joseph's lineage could be traced back to King David, who was born in Bethlehem, he and his espoused needed to go there for the census. It just so happened that while they were there in Bethlehem, Jesus was born. Matthew says nothing about any of this. His parents are in Bethlehem, and he's born there in Matthew. There's no census, no trip to Bethlehem, no statement about there being no room in the inn, or any of the rest of it that you find in Luke. Luke alone mentions the shepherds who come to worship the infant Jesus. Matthew alone mentions the wise men who followed the star that stood over the house where Jesus lay. Matthew alone mentions the wrath of King Herod, who learns of the child and sets out to destroy it by slaughtering every child 2 years and under in Bethlehem. And Matthew alone indicates that Joseph and Mary escaped in time by fleeing to Egypt, where they stayed until Herod died, and then returned only to relocate in Nazareth in order to avoid the wrath of Herod's son, who is now ruling. These differences may be puzzling. Virtually all the stories in Luke are found only in Luke, and all the stories in Matthew are found only in Matthew, but they're not necessarily contradictory. Some of the differences, though, do appear to represent actual discrepancies. Where, for example, was Joseph and Mary's hometown? In Luke, it's clearly Nazareth. What about Matthew? Well, the wise men who've been following the star for a long time, remember, Herod kills every child 2 years and under when he hears about his being born, and presumably he would have known that an infant just born wouldn't be toddling around in the yard someplace. Why does he kill everybody 2 years? Because the wise men have been on a trip for so long. Where do the wise men find Jesus? They find him in a house in Bethlehem. When Joseph and Mary return from Egypt, where do they first want to return? To Bethlehem. Only when they find out that Herod's son is ruling do they decide to relocate to Nazareth. Where's their hometown? Depends which account you read. If Matthew is right that Joseph and Mary fled to Egypt to escape Herod's wrath, how is it that they returned immediately to Nazareth just 30 days after Jesus was born, as Luke indicates? In addition, I should point out that in addition to these discrepancies, there are aspects of these accounts that strike historians as completely implausible. Let me take just Luke's account quickly. We have a relatively good documentation for the reign of Caesar Augustus, but there's no mention in any source of any kind of a worldwide census during his reign. Moreover, how could there have been a census like this, where everyone registered at the home of their distant ancestors? Joseph, according to the account, has to register in Bethlehem because he's descended from David. But David lived 1,000 years earlier. Everyone in the empire is going to the home of their ancestors from 1,000 years earlier? How would they know where to go? If we had a census like that today, where would you go? Imagine the mass migrations involved. And how is it that no source of any kind from the time even bothers to mention it? Moreover, we know from other accounts, the Jewish historian Josephus, the Roman historian Tacitus, and some inscriptions, that Quirinius was not the governor of Syria during the reign of King Herod in Palestine, but only 10 years later. It appears then that these accounts could not have happened, at least as narrated. But probably the ultimate point is that they aren't best read as objective accounts of actual history in any event. These stories are both trying to make a point. Both want to emphasize that even though Jesus came from Nazareth, he really was born in Bethlehem. Well, why would they want to emphasize that? No doubt because the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, said that the future ruler of Israel would come from Bethlehem. Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Matthew and Luke want to emphasize that Jesus did come from there. Both want to emphasize that Jesus was an extraordinary person from the beginning. What evidence is there for that? According to both authors, his mother, in fact, was a virgin. These stories, in other words, are trying to convey ideas about Jesus. But when looked at as historical sources for what really happened, they appear in places to be inaccurate. My overarching point is that the Gospels contain narratives that appear to have been changed, modified over time in order to stress theological insights into who the authors believed Jesus was. In conclusion, I should say that the Gospels appear to be full of that kind of story. We could look at example after example of places where there are discrepancies in the Gospels, but that would probably be neither fruitful nor interesting. Instead, it's better simply to accept the Gospels for what they are, documents that are trying to tell the truth about Jesus, even if that truth is not always based on events that actually happened. Let me be clear, though, that I'm not saying that every story in the Gospels is completely inaccurate. The Gospels no doubt do contain historically reliable material that will be of considerable use to us as we try to establish what Jesus really said and did. but they also contain historically inaccurate material, and part of our task will be deciding which is which. Before pursuing that task, though, it'll be important for us to learn more about these books. For instance, who their authors were and where they got their stories. That will be the task of the next lecture.